Ben has been just joined Argilla a couple of months ago, and what we've been noticing when actually moving from the old datasets that we had in Argilla that everyone knows and loves, like the text classification dataset, token classification dataset, and actually the new feedback dataset was that, there was this weird coexistence of both at the same time, which also led to some implementations that weren't optimal, that were actually optimized for the feedback dataset, but didn't really translate back properly to the old data sets, and also the other way around. So that's actually when we started to think about Argilla 2.0, so to say, where we were striving for feature parity between the old data sets and the new data sets. And when Ben joined, he actually got the nice task to actually start reconstructing and rethinking what the new feedback, the new SDK should look like. And we actually had this sessions and user interviews to get as much feedback as possible. And that's also where we got some feedback from Louis. And it's, besides Ben, of course, also the rest of the team worked on it a lot. But I'll let Ben maybe introduce the topic and what his experiences were, and then he will walk you through the new SDK of Argilla, so to say.
Cool. Thanks, David. Yeah, we've got quite a bit of material here to share that you can probably go away and look at afterwards. I'm going to walk mainly through this notebook, which is just specifically for this session. We've also got a blog post on it, which kind of tells the backstory, the stuff that David was just alluding to there, and how it fits within the roadmap at Argilla. And then we've also got new documentation that I'll come around to specifically for this SDK. So there's a lot of material for you to tuck into after this. And I think if I were you, if I was using Argilla regularly, the first thing I'd ask would be when, like what's the timeline? So I think it's a good place to start. And it's over the next month we'll release this. But then once we release it, the legacy data sets will still be supported for a period of time. And I'll come to those kind of details at the end of the notebook. But at the moment, we'll be moving over to this in the main Argilla repository in the next month. Okay, this notebook, obviously, as it says, uses an experimental version of the SDK that's actually installed from a separate repository. And how did we end up here, right? So we noticed, as David's already mentioned, that the SDK with the feedback datasets and the legacy datasets was, let's say, overstretched. And we found it difficult to build features for and to contribute to. And then Natalia and I went out to the community and tried to get more feedback. And we asked them what they thought about it and how they experienced it. And they told us that they summed it up into these 3 points, right? We had a lot of information, but we simplified it down to these 3 points. And the first was that they loved the feedback data sets, that they made total sense and that it was compatible with how they were working. And it wasn't that we should throw that away. The second point was that the growing functionality was becoming difficult to learn and difficult to stay up to date with. So we were adding methods and it was growing and growing, but the users weren't able to keep track of this. And we as software engineers interpreted that as a kind of a lack of pattern, maybe that there wasn't a kind of logical pattern in the way that these objects were growing. And then the third point was that they actually loved the documentation as well, and that it was an amazing learning resource, but it wasn't a good resource to work with on a day-to-day basis. If you were maintaining Argilla in production, it could be difficult to find specifics, difficult to get short, concise overviews of how to do something. And I think we all know that software and documentation coexist, the two sides of the same coin. And I think that's especially the case for an SDK, as you're constantly trying to understand how the right way to use an SDK, you'll go backwards and forwards to the documentation, even if you're an experienced user of that SDK. So the project that we set out to do was to, in fact, rewrite the SDK or refactor the SDK and rewrite the docs as well. So that's what we did, and that's what we're sharing with you inside the same repository that you'll see here is called Argilla Python. That's its experimental location, and it will eventually go over into Argilla. And it has the docs of a sort of experimental location as well, which you can see. At the end of the notebook, I'll come back to these docs to show you through the API. But from a high level, this is how it looks. At the moment, it's imported as Argilla SDK, but eventually it will just be Argilla as it is now. And we use the same abbreviation, RG, and many of the classes have roughly the same names. But the main one that you'll notice that's changed is the dataset, which is no longer a feedback dataset. It doesn't make sense anymore, as we're not going to delineate between legacy datasets and a feedback dataset. We're just going to have one, and we're going to call it a dataset or an Argilla dataset. And so I'll move through the process, and the notebook goes through this in a kind of process format. It installs it from its branch. And we really start off with the first major change here. So much like rg.init, we'll still be given a URL and a key. We still interact with the server in the same way, but we'll use this Argilla class to create a client. And that client becomes basically our gateway to the server. So the client has an attribute named users, and we can iterate over all the users on our server. And we can get those users based on their name, and then we can interact with that user in various ways, and to access its attributes and to check if it exists, check if it's real or not. We can do the same with workspaces. We can check all of the workspaces on our server. We can iterate over them and print their attributes. And then we have other methods and attributes within those. Like, for example, we can say workspace.dataset, and we can look at all of the data sets within a workspace. We have a lot in there. And then we can access the attributes of those data sets. So let's say print their names. So that's the first kind of major change, right? How we interact with the server. We've gone from a more method-based approach to an attribute-based one, where the core resources of a server are held behind attributes. And resource is a term that I'll come back to. It defines our architecture pattern, where we say that all of these core items, users, workspaces, and datasets, are resources. Okay, so the next major change of the new SDK, if you look through this blog post, you'll see that I've split it up into these separate sections. The first one being connecting to the server, and the next one is defining feedback tasks. So I think, or I hope, that all machine learning engineers take defining feedback tasks really seriously, because it defines the quality of the data that you're going to get back in feedback. If an annotator understands a task, they'll give better feedback and you'll get better data. So for Argilla, it's really important that our feedback tasks are easy to define. And so we refactored the data set so that it no longer is coupled to the feedback task. And we move the feedback task to a separate class called settings. So inside settings, you'll say, okay, these are my guidelines. Here, they're just a string, but they could just as easily be a markdown file. Here are my fields. So the things that are coming in. So if this could be a prompt, it could be a document, it could be multiple fields like a title and a document, or a title, a summary, and a document. And they're all defined as text fields. And then I'll define my questions, rating, ranking, and the questions haven't significantly changed, in fact. You'll be familiar with the attributes of settings, but we'll do that in a specific place, a specific class named settings. And one of the main advantages of that is that we can then take those settings and put those into different data sets. So we've decoupled the task away, and we say, okay, there's one, let's say there's one feedback setting that I want to use, but I'm doing that on multiple different data sets. So I'll move those settings into different places. I can, in fact, then move that data set onto multiple different clients as well by defining a different client. We'll come to that. Okay, so we've decoupled settings and data sets, and then how do we create them? So we use quite a simplified approach now to these major server actions. We use a CRUD action. So when we want to create something, we say thing.create, in this case dataset.create, but it could be workspace.create or user.create. When we want to update it, we say update, and when we want to delete, we say delete. We don't use read because we read everything via the client. So in the same way I showed you here, when we want to read something, we do it like this. Okay, so that's our first data set. Now, if we want to get a data set, as I showed you here, it's the same model. We say dataset name, and we return it. And now we're pulling a data set from the server. And that's in fact the same data set that we created here, right? We're just pulling it back. But it could just as easily be a data set that you created in another script or in another notebook at another point in time. And so the next block of major changes after the settings is now the records. How do we add records? How do we update records on the server? And I also go over that in detail in the blog post, and we've got a guide in the documentation over here, which goes into much more detail than I am here on adding and updating records. So I'd recommend that you take a look at those. And I would say that managing records is the most significant change in the SDK. So let's start off, let's load a data set that we can use just for the sake of this example. And the data set that we're going to use is one that we created with Hugging Face as part of the Data is Better Together project. It's called 10K prompts ranked, and it's 10,000 prompts manually ranked using Argilla. And we're going to add this to our Argilla server over here in a number of different ways. So this is our server. In fact, what I should do is make a new one, so that's clean. Cool, let's make sure I get a clean one. Cool, yeah, you see I've been playing around with this notebook a few times, so these numbers are getting a bit high. Okay, so we want to add records, right? So we've got our data set, the data is better together. Now, this data set has some metadata like the agreement ratio and the number of responses from annotators, the average rating, these kind of things. So we can use these as metadata in our Argilla dataset, but we didn't add metadata to the settings earlier. So what we can do now is update those settings in the dataset settings by saying dataset.settings.metadata.add, and then the attributes that we need. We're going to add the average rating, the agreement ratio, and we're going to add this terms metadata property for source. So that's just going to help me show you where the records come from when we add them. So the ones that I add from datasets, I'll use that tag and like this. So, okay, those are our metadata properties. And that's a change from the previous version of the SDK where we couldn't do that. Okay, the first approach, which I think is probably the most familiar, will be to instantiate record classes and then pass those to the log method. Now, that's probably a combination of two areas of Argilla there, because we're defining a class that's a lot like a feedback record class that's now called a record. And we're putting it in the log method, which versions of the legacy datasets will be familiar with. And the log method can both add and update records, right? It will do that based on the identifier, the ID that you pass to the record. So when should you use this approach as opposed to the others I'll show you below? So I'd say it's quite simple, really. You should instantiate records when you have some kind of logic that's necessary in order to construct that record. And in order to construct that, you might be iterating over something. That could be an API, for example, that you're requesting from, or some streaming source. And you can't necessarily wrangle a data structure into a format that's ready for feedback. You need to iterate over something and perform some logic, this kind of block here. And when that goes on, you would want to define this record class fully like this. And the ways that I'll show you below don't need to define these record classes entirely. So we're performing this basic logic. Here you see it, we round down this integer. We round down this floating point value into an integer. And we take the agreement ratio from the dictionary. We create an ID by hashing the prompt. And if the responses are just one, if there's only one response, we skip that record and move on to the next one. And then we define the record class much in the same way that we do in the current SDK. And we pass this record ID, which is our custom or personal ID for that record. It can be anything, and it should be unique, right? Okay, so we run that. How many did I add in the end? I took 100. Okay, and then so we've just added those 100 records. So if I refresh Argilla over here, okay, so we've got 60 records. That's not 100, and that's because I skipped all of these lower ones that only had a one response. And what we'll see is that our suggestions have been added, and we see records as we expect. We see our metadata. Anyone that hasn't used Argilla in a while might be impressed by this metadata view. It's a new feature. It's pretty cool. And you see our average rating, our ingredient ratio, and our source. This was from a record. And there's 60 of those. Cool. Okay, so now let's update some records, right? So you noticed in the first one I made a mistake, if you will. I round down this average rating. So let's go over that again and use a proper round method and update those. So I'm going to add this ID again, put that there because it's better. And that's just a hash of the prompt. So it's a unique identifier for the prompt. It could be a UUID, it could be anything. And that's going to allow Argilla to match these records with the ones that I added before. And so we're going to iterate over those 100 records again. And you'll see now that we get 100 records. And that's because I didn't skip all of the ones that only had one response this time, right? So I added every single one. That's why it's 100, but it's not 159. And that's because the log method can both add and update records based on that identifier, based on the ID. And what you'll see now is that we have updated the average rating. It's an integer, and it's been updated in the metadata, but not in the responses. What you'll see here is that, yeah, you have this average rating, 3.5, and it's not been updated there. Cool, correct? Not on that record. Okay, maybe I need to refresh. Okay, okay, I'll move on to the next one. So the next one is to take this pass a dataset object to the log method. So this is a Hugging Face dataset from the datasets package. And this is probably the most common route to an Argilla dataset, right? Because you have an established dataset or a dataset repo on the hub that you're using for your project, and you want to move that across to Argilla so that you can do some feedback. So when should you use this? When you already have a dataset in the datasets library, or you have a dataset that can be represented and manipulated in that package, and you don't need to perform any logic like we did with a record class. When should you not use that? If you need to apply that logic. So this is the same dataset that I loaded before, but we're just going to take 10 samples this time. And we're going to just do some basic pre-processing, same as we did before. We round down, and we're using the map method of dataset. And this is how we'd recommend that you use it, that you use the framework like datasets. It could just as easily be pandas. And you use those frameworks to do that data wrangling or that pre-processing, and not do that in Argilla or through some kind of loop. So we're going to get that same data set back again. We don't in fact need to do that. And we're now going to log these records from the data set. And we get a load of warnings. Why do we get these warnings? We're being warned that there's attributes in the rows that we're not putting in Argilla. So in this case, that doesn't matter because we're just working with prompt rating and this source attribute. Okay, it was 100. And now it's 110. If we filter down metadata, we say source, just as it came from data sets. Yeah, okay, you'll see we get 10 there. And these are those 10 that we added then. Cool, okay. That works in roughly the same way, except we didn't need to iterate. We just added the data set as it was. Okay, now can we update the record? This time we're going to add the records again, but we're going to give them an ID this time. So in fact, what I should be doing is this, otherwise I won't be able to filter them. And so you might ask here, okay, how does Argilla, like where does this match up? How is the column being magically added to the metadata field in this case? Like in the instantiation route here, we said metadata and we gave it a nice dictionary, and it was pretty clear how the metadata was defined. But now that we're using datasets, it's not so clear, right? Like these are just, could be the columns of that dataset. And so where do these come from? When you define the dataset in settings, we define the dataset settings, you'll give the metadata value a name, the questions a name, and the fields a name. And the log method will match up the field names, the keys, and the column names to those question, metadata, and field names in Argilla. And if they match, then Argilla will use those. And if they don't match, Argilla will skip those. And just below, I'll show you a way of dealing with that. Let's have a look at that in Argilla. Okay, so now we should have 20, I think. Yeah, so 20, okay. And those are the ones I added there. Cool, so that was the real average rating. If I sort those by inserted at descending, then I'll see the last ones. Actually, it should be dated at descending. Cool, okay, so those are records. And now I can update those. I'm gonna have to do that to make sure I can find it. Okay, so this is the same again, same ID, but now we've made the rating 1. And we'll see that those first 10 all have a rating of 1. Cool, okay. So what would this mean for you? It would mean that you can work on your data set outside of Argilla, and then when that data set has changes, you would then be able to put those back in the log method, and Argilla would update the Argilla data set to the changes in the datasets data set. Cool. And so then the last method, which I think you have to see as like the base method or like the most raw method, it's not something that we would expect you to use in this way here. This is an example of a generic data structure, right? So in this case, it's just a Python list of Python dictionaries with keys that match the Argilla data set. But it could also be another data structure, a third-party data structure. It could come from Pandas. We're going to implement a Pandas integration in the next few weeks, but let's say that this could be another source. And we can use this source in the same way that we use datasets, right? We can pass it to the log method, and Argilla will identify the keys and match those up to the Argilla dataset. We can give it a ID, like the datasets, and Argilla will match up the IDs. And so then the next section, which I'll show you with these dictionaries because it's a bit clearer to show, is the mapping parameter that the log method takes, right? So here we're mapping our input data to Argilla, and we can say, okay, in my data source, in the input, I've got a key named text, and in Argilla, I've got a, in this case, field named prompt, but it could just as easily be a question or metadata or a vector. And I want Argilla to map those two together. And when we do that, it will map those together, it will add those two. And the advantage of this is that you can leave that data source as it is, right? You don't need to manipulate your data structure in order to make it compatible with Argilla, but you also don't need to iterate over it and instantiate classes in order to work with Argilla. Okay, so as well as all of the attributes of an Argilla dataset can be mapped in that way, right? And here we map IDs, which is quite handy. And we map ID, and we can combine that with updating. Let me see that here. And then the last dimension of updating, the last dimension of mapping, sorry, is to use a dot notation. For all of these examples I've shown you, we've added suggestions because those are the default route into Argilla for question answers, right? And let's say there are two types of question answer that you'll know if you're an Argilla user: suggestions and responses. A suggestion is something that comes from a model or is predicted. It might come from a function, in fact, but its purpose is to help the annotator to annotate. And a response is a response to the question. It's typically a gold standard source. So it might come from, let's say you have a data set that has been partially annotated, and you want to consume all of the records that have already been answered with responses, and the rest you want the annotators to work on, then you might use those responses. And so in this mapping function, instead of using the default, mapping it to a suggestion, we can say, okay, this is a response, and I want you to map this value straight to the response. We can do the same with other sources into this dot notation. And if we instantiated the class, we would do this by adding a responses parameter into the record class. Okay. So that's probably a lot of information there. And if you want to go back and pick over those more slowly, you can ask me questions at the end. And you can also check out these how-to guides that go through each of the examples I've shown you, and they break those down in this simple way. And I'll also just give you this summary here, because this is probably the most common view of that process, right? Like I've taken it all apart and really exposed it to you there. But in reality, this is what you'll do on a kind of day-to-day basis with Argilla. You would pick up the dataset from datasets from the hub using the load dataset method function. And then you would retrieve your dataset from Argilla. So you'd say client.datasets and then your dataset name. You might, in fact, do some pre-processing. In this case, yeah, you'd have to in order to turn that average rating into an integer. And then you would log those to Argilla using the log method. Yeah. And that's what that looks like on a, we should see that we get those, once that's done, we get those 100 rows extra. Cool. Okay, and now I'm going to go on to getting records from Argilla, so querying and exporting. But I'm open to any questions now. If anyone has any more low-level questions about the specifics of those methods and the specifics of that process, feel free to just let me know.
Yeah, so there was one question that I wanted to ask to emphasize. What are all things that you can update when doing this log method?
You can update all of the attributes of a record. It's not limited.
Yeah, because I think for maybe the one of the for Martin, for example, from Datamaran that's actually listening in, I believe he also had this idea or this need for actually being able to update fields and these kind of things, and so that's possible from now on.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that we can update fields. Paco might have to interject and correct me, but I'm pretty sure that we can update fields. We can update all the attributes. We had the previous issue. Go ahead, Paco.
No, the current backend, I think, is not supporting yet the updating fields, but
Okay,
this is something that we can easily adapt to. The thing is that now this kind of way of working with records is easier to provide this kind of improvement easily.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. What we have changed in last week was actually that we allow not updating fields. So this was based on some feedback that we got a few weeks ago, that we previously required a field in order to update, which meant that you couldn't do this basically. You couldn't just update the metadata of a record. And now we can do that. So you don't need to update the fields. Yeah. Sorry. That's the opposite of what Martin asked for.
No problem. Just to emphasize and to clarify.
Cool.
Thanks for answering the question.
Okay, so if I now just move on to the exporting and querying records, we've got a specific syntax for this. And this is what it looks like. I'll break it up like that just so it's a bit clearer. We use these filter and query classes. And so a query can be a term that we just passed to a data set record. So as I showed you above, we can iterate over the records of a data set like this. And when we do that, we can pass a query. A query could in fact just be a term like this, but it can also be a more complex query object. You could do this, but there wouldn't be much point. And so you can query within your filter. So you say, okay, this is my filter object, and I want to filter all of the metadata, all of the records with metadata attribute average rating greater than or equal to 2, and less than or equal to 5. So I create a range. And within that range, I want to query for the term Python. And then I want to iterate over all of the records and print out their suggestions and their metadata. And that's what we do there. So that's one of the core ways that you'd interact with receiving records from the Argilla server, right? Once you've done that, you can then export them. And at the moment, we have 3 main ways of exporting. We can go back to a dataset's dataset. We can go to a list, so to a Python list of Python dictionaries, which are a nested structure that you can serialize, or they can be a flattened structure if you need to add them to a table, and a dictionary where the names of the attribute and an array structure similar to pandas. And in the next month, we'll also integrate a pandas integration so that you can go to a data frame. Okay, so the other core settings, or change, sorry, are the settings. And this is quite a recent one. So you can update the settings of a data set. I actually already showed you this above when I added metadata to use it with the Data is Better Together dataset. But by using this metadata.add, and it could also be vector.add, questions.add, you can add other attributes to your Argilla dataset that you'll then be able to add in records. And they'll be reflected in the settings, and they will be reflected in the UI. Okay, so that's the end of the kind of the walkthrough of the code. This is the kind of the last area, which I already introduced at the top of the conversation, sorry. How does this impact your current project? What does it mean? That you're probably, or you will be coming from one of 2 places. One is that you are using extensible datasets through the feedback dataset. And in which case, this will not really impact your project. You'll need to refactor to the syntax, but it will work with your existing server and it will work in a roughly similar way. If you're working with text classification datasets, then it will have they won't be supported in version 2 of Argilla, but they'll be exposed via a legacy library, similar to how Pydantic exposes V1, and will offer tooling to help you migrate over to V2. But those legacy datasets won't be compatible with this SDK, or they won't be included within the SDK. Okay.
Hey, may I jump in with a quick question before the next section?
There isn't a next section, it's a Q&A, so it's a perfect time.
All right. Look, apologies because my question isn't exactly technical about specific functions, but it is about a use case, okay? So the open source fintech ecosystem, including Lloyds Bank, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley, created what they call CDM, Common Data Model. And that's 2,000 pages of taxonomy. And the way they did it was, here's the law, random group of devs make this into a data object, right? Using their own scripting language, which is like a bastard hell child of Java and CP or .NET, as far as I can tell. And they just had a hackathon where everyone had bright ideas but no skills. And one of those bright ideas was, can we audit every line item of 2,000 page taxonomy using GPT-4, knowing that they've tried it before on partial and it comes out great. And they were like, hey, can you make this auditor for us? And I was like, yeah, sure, I know. LangChain, LangChain doesn't work anymore. Llama Index is a disaster also. And now I joined late And what I'm catching is literally this use case, or did I get that wrong?
Do you mean the use case in the data is better together project?
No, not data is better together project. This one specific use. How about this use case? Can I take a taxonomy, make it into lines in a CSV, load it up, and then use Argilla in a smart way to verify each line of their taxonomy definition using a smart prompt? It seems like it's exactly what we're talking about.
Argilla, in fact, wouldn't.
The SDK.
Yeah, wouldn't directly help you there, right?
No.
You would be able to use the SDK to get that CSV into Argilla, and then you'd have to manually review that, and that'd be quite a time-consuming process, I expect. But what you could use is distillable. You could define a custom prompt inside distillable to load that CSV structure, and then review that and evaluate that. And yeah, I'd recommend that you look at our other tool, distillable.
Okay. Sounds so stupid. It sounds so stupid of me, but thank you so much for this insight.
No, it's a completely logical assumption,
connection,
because
right?
the two packages kind of work hand in hand, right? So you could set that out in distillable, and then your pipeline could end in Argilla, and you would review that in Argilla, right?
That's fantastic. Thank you for solving that for me. I'm gonna look like a genius at work, quote unquote.
Okay.
Perfect. And keep us updated also on the outcome. Curious to hear that in our Slack. I also had a question for you, Ben. So what were the most difficult and rewarding parts of refactoring the SDK? And maybe you have some recommendations for people that are doing like a heavy refactor.
Yeah, I'll start with the most rewarding. Nice question. The most rewarding part, I think, is probably, I found it a really rewarding project because I really love Argilla. So I really love human feedback. I really love the annotation process. It's really what makes me tick in terms of machine learning. So I found it really rewarding to think through that and to think, okay, how can a machine learning engineer define this task? And to do that from a blank slate is a really exciting process, and a kind of high risk process as well. So that for me was rewarding. But then I suppose that in some ways, that's probably also the most challenging, because when you start from a blank slate, the chance that you miss features and that you go back and not just forward is much greater than if you start exactly where you left off and you clean up the software that's already there, right? If you're cleaning something, it's much harder to go backwards. And so I think in hindsight, I probably would have started more from the existing SDK and then had the clean slate as more of a pot, and then at a certain point switched. But I don't know whether that would have been possible or not. But that's something that I felt that it's really difficult to make sure that you've covered everything when you start from a clean slate.
Yeah, building from scratch or.
Yeah, totally.
But yeah, at least what you mentioned, that was already overstretched the old SDK. So I guess in that sense, it's nice to really start from scratch, get the user feedback, and start over clean for 2.0. And I guess the results are, we'll see the coming weeks, but the results seem very promising from the initial user feedback that we've been getting. And it's looking forward to getting a lot more from everyone within the community. Sorry, what?
Yeah, I was just going to ask if there are any more questions.
I guess not. So then for everyone that's attended, thanks for attending. Hope to see you during the next sessions. Any feedback or comments or whatever, feel free to contact us on Slack or LinkedIn, any other socials. And I would like to thank Ben for the presentation as well. Hope to see you next time.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.